I'm Dr. Christy, and this is Climbing Fish Parenting, practical parenting strategies in 20 minutes or less. I'm a psychologist and behavior analyst, and I work with exhausted, overwhelmed parents who feel like they've tried everything and nothing works. If you're listening to this while folding the laundry, hiding in your car, or wishing bedtime would just end already, you're in the right place. Today, I want to challenge something that almost every parent believes without ever questioning it. That kids are either good at handling their feelings or they're not. That some kids just have it and some kids don't. I don't think that's true. And by the end of this episode, I think you won't either. Ready to transform your parenting journey? Let's dive in. I asked a dad I work with to tell me how he went about teaching his son to ride a bike. He didn't hand him the bike and just say, "Ride it." He held the seat. He ran alongside. He let his son wobble and catch himself over and over for an entire summer. When his son finally pedaled off down the driveway on his own, the dad told me he actually teared up a little right there on the sidewalk. Months of patient, repeated hands-on teaching, finally clicking. Feelings take the same patience and support. We just don't often think about it. 2 weeks after that conversation, that same dad was standing in the kitchen, completely out of patience, telling his son to just calm down during a meltdown over a broken cookie. No scaffolding, no practiced runs, no holding the seat while he wobbled. Just an instruction, delivered once, expected to land. He told me afterward, half laughing, half horrified at himself, I never would have expected him to just know how to ride a bike. Why did I expect him to just know how to calm down? We talked about that question for a while. And what came out of that conversation is most of what I want to walk you through today, because here's what's actually remarkable about that dad. And I don't think he gave himself enough credit for it. He already knew exactly how to teach a skill. He'd done it beautifully with the bike. He held the seat. He ran alongside. He let his son wobble without rescuing him too soon. And he stayed close enough to catch him if it went really wrong. That is almost exactly what teaching emotion regulation looks like. He just didn't realize the same process applied here because nobody had ever told him that calming down was a skill. The same way that riding a bike is a skill. He thought it was supposed to just be there, the way some kids are naturally good at sports and some aren't. I'm here to tell you today that it isn't. And once that dad saw the parallel, he stopped expecting his son to just know how and started teaching it the same patient, hands-on way he'd taught everything else. That's this whole episode, really. That one shift. Think about how your child learned to tie their shoes. Nobody expected them to just know how. You showed them. You did it slowly, probably 100 times. Probably narrating every step out loud. Bunny ears, cross them, pull them through. You let them practice while you held the loops steady. You let them mess it up. You showed them again. Nobody looked at a 5-year-old struggling with laces and said, well, I guess some kids just aren't shoe tying people. Now, think about how your child is expected to learn to handle big feelings. Mostly nobody really teaches it. It's expected to just appear. Be a big boy, use your words, calm down. Take a deep breath. These are instructions, not lessons. They tell a child what the finished skill should look like without ever walking them through how to build it. And when a kid can't do it, when the breath doesn't come, when the words don't come, when calm doesn't come, we call that a behavior problem. We rarely call it what it actually is, a skill that was never taught. I want you to sit with that for a second because I think it's the single biggest reframe I can offer you about why this is so hard. Emotion regulation is not a personality trait. It's not something your child either has or doesn't have, like eye color. It's a skill, a built, learned, practiced skill, exactly like tying shoes, exactly like reading, exactly like riding a bike, and like every other skill a child has ever learned. Some kids pick it up faster than others. Some need way more repetition. And some need an entirely different teaching approach to get there at all. Nobody is born knowing how to regulate a flood of feeling. Every single person who can do it now learned to do it. The only question is whether they had real teaching or whether they were just expected to figure it out. Now, let's get specific about what skill actually means here, because I don't want this to stay abstract. When your child is overwhelmed, like really overwhelmed, not just mildly annoyed, there's a specific brain process that has to happen for them to come back down. The amygdala, the brain's alarm system, has gone off. Something in the prefrontal cortex has to step in, recognize what's happening, and actively work to bring the alarm back down to a manageable level. That stepping in isn't automatic. It's a skill with actual components, and each component has to be built separately. First, your child has to notice they're escalating before they're all the way escalated. That's a skill, a big one. Some kids, especially kids with differences in interoception, that's the sense that lets you read your own body signals. They genuinely don't feel the early warning signs the way other kids do. They go from 0 to completely overwhelmed with what feels, from the outside to us, and on the inside to them, like no warning at all. Second, once they notice, they have to actually do something with that information. Pause. Choose a different response than the one their body is screaming at them to do. That is an entirely separate skill from noticing. Plenty of kids can tell you afterward exactly when they started to escalate and still couldn't do anything different in the moment, because noticing and acting are not the same skill. Third, they have to have an actual tool to reach for, a strategy, something concrete to do instead of melting down. And here's something I think gets missed constantly. You cannot reach for a tool you were never taught. A child who's never been walked through what to actually do when they're overwhelmed doesn't have a toolbox to open. They have an empty drawer. 3 separate components: noticing, acting, and having something to act with. Every one of them has to be built, practiced, and reinforced. And for a lot of kids who are wired differently, one or more of those components is genuinely harder to build than it is for other kids. Here's why I think it's so important to separate these 3 apart instead of treating emotion regulation as one big, vague skill. If you don't know which piece is actually missing, you end up trying to fix the wrong thing. Parents spend months teaching breathing exercises to a kid whose actual gap is noticing. And the breathing exercise sits in the toolbox, unused, because the child never realized they needed it until it was already too late to reach for it. Later, when they do have that skill, they might not connect it, because when they learned the breathing exercise, they weren't using it. Or parents assume their child just isn't trying hard enough to calm down, when the real issue is that nobody ever actually taught them what calm down should look like. So they need to practice step by step, the way you'd teach any other skill. That's the cost of treating this as one thing instead of 3 separate skills. You can do everything right and still miss the actual gap, simply because you were aiming at the wrong target. This is where I want to bring in how this plays out differently depending on how your child's brain works, because the skill building piece isn't identical for every kid. For a lot of kids with ADHD, the noticing piece and the acting piece are often where the real gap lives. The signal that something's escalating can come in late, and even when it arrives, the brain's ability to pause before reacting is often the exact skill that's hardest to access. This is consistent with what's now understood about emotional impulsivity being a core common feature of ADHD, not a separate behavior problem layered on top of the attention piece, but part of the actual profile for a lot of kids. The reaction and the awareness of the reaction can arrive at almost the same moment, which leaves almost no gap to insert a pause into. What this often looks like at home is your child that seems completely fine one second and then fully explodes the next, with what feels like zero transition between the two. From the outside, it looks instant. In a real sense, for that specific brain, it nearly is. The noticing and the acting are happening so close together that there's barely room to wedge a different choice into the gap. For a lot of kids with autism, the gap often shows up differently, sometimes in how reliably the early warning signs get read at all. and sometimes in how much capacity is left to even attempt a regulation strategy after a day spent managing sensory input and social demands that most brains don't have to consciously manage. By the time the moment of overwhelm arrives, there may simply be less left in reserve to do the noticing and acting we just talked about. This often looks like your child that can sometimes regulate beautifully on an easy day and completely falls apart over something tiny on a hard day. It's tempting to read that as inconsistency or even manipulation, but it's neither. It's a skill that requires a certain amount of available capacity to execute, and the capacity itself is the part that varies. Sometimes day to day, sometimes hour to hour. And when we have different levels of capacity, it also influences our ability to learn these skills. For kids who are anxious, there's a version of this too, though the mechanism is a little different. The alarm itself tends to fire on a hair trigger, which means the noticing piece isn't really the problem. The problem is that the alarm is going off so often and so intensely that there's rarely a calm enough moment to practice the pause and the toolbox pieces at all. Everything feels urgent, which makes everything feel like an emergency that doesn't have room for a strategy. This isn't about one profile being worse at this than another. It's that the skill has multiple separate components, and different brains run into friction at different points along the way. Knowing where your specific child gets stuck is what actually tells you what to build next, which is very different from they just need to try harder, or they need more consequences for melting down. A consequence doesn't teach noticing. A consequence doesn't teach pausing. And a consequence definitely doesn't put a tool in an empty drawer. You can't punish a skill into existing that was never built in the first place. Okay, so if this is a skill and not a trait, the natural next question is, how do you actually teach this? Start by externalizing the noticing piece, since a lot of kids can't yet do this internally. This means you become the early warning system for a while, not calm down after the explosion has already started. Something earlier, more neutral, more observational. I notice your voice is getting louder. I wonder if something's building. You're not asking them to self-diagnose in real time. You're naming what you're seeing out loud so they eventually learn to notice it themselves. Here's why this works the way it does. Right now, the only person in the house who reliably notices the early warning signs is you. That means the noticing skill currently lives entirely outside your child. It's something you do for them, not something they do. Every time you name it out loud, you're handing them a tiny piece of language and pattern recognition that they get to borrow again and again until eventually some of it becomes theirs. This doesn't happen in one conversation. It happens over months, through repetition, the same way every other skill on this list gets built. Practice the pause when nothing is wrong. This is the piece almost everyone skips, and it's the reason so many regulation strategies fail in the moment. You can't expect a brand new skill to work for the first time under maximum stress. Practice the pause and choose moment during calm, low-stakes times, where you call out a feeling and they pick a response card. A silly freeze and breathe game before dinner. A round of what would you do if, using a pretend scenario that has nothing to do with anything that feels too real or threatening. It needs to happen often, and it needs to happen when the stakes are low, so the pathway exists by the time the stakes are high. I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters. The first 10 times you practice this, it is going to feel pointless. Your child isn't overwhelmed, so there's nothing to actually regulate, and it can feel like you're just playing a slightly odd game for no reason. That feeling is normal, and it's not a sign that it's not working. You're building a pathway before you need it. Like a fire drill. Nobody expects a fire drill to feel urgent. It's still the reason people know what to do when the alarm is real. And build the toolbox before you need it, not during the storm. Sit down on a calm day and actually generate, together, 3 or 4 things your child could do when they're feeling overwhelmed. Not a generic list you found online. Things that work for their specific sensory and emotional profile. Squeeze something. Go somewhere quiet. Push against a wall. Get a drink of cold water. Put on noise-canceling headphones. hold something with a strong, specific texture. The tool has to already exist in their mind before the moment arrives. The same way you can't expect someone to use a fire extinguisher correctly for the first time during an actual fire. One more thing about the toolbox specifically. Write it down or draw it and put it somewhere visible, not because your child won't remember it exists, but because remembering that a tool exists requires the exact working memory capacity that's often the first thing to go offline during overwhelm. A list on the fridge or a card taped inside a closet door isn't a backup for a bad memory. It's a bypass for a brain that's temporarily too flooded to retrieve anything from the inside. And if your child is old enough to have the conversation, bring them into naming where their own gap is, not as an accusation, as a genuine question asked when things are calm. When you're really upset, do you usually know it's coming, or does it feel like it just happens all at once? When you're in it, can you think of anything to do, or does your brain just go blank? Kids are often really accurate about this once you ask directly. And a kid who can name their own gap is a kid who's already started building the very skill of noticing that we talked about. The question itself is part of the teaching. Okay, so this week, pick just one of the three components, noticing, pausing, or having a tool, and work on that one alone. Don't try to build all three at once. If you're not sure which one is the actual gap for your kid, here's a clue. If they can tell you afterwards exactly what was happening and exactly when it started, the gap probably isn't noticing. If they freeze or do the same unhelpful thing every single time, even when they clearly know better, the gap is probably the toolbox. If they seem to have no warning at all, not even in hindsight, the gap is probably the noticing itself. Find the piece that's actually missing and build that one piece. On purpose, this week, I'll tell you something else. Everything we talked about today, the noticing, the pausing, the toolbox, sits on top of something even more basic that most parents never get a straight answer on. Why are feelings so hard for some kids in the first place, especially kids who are wired differently? There's a free training series opening up on exactly that, called Why Your Kid Can't Calm Down. It opens July 6th. I've been running free trainings like this the last few months, and I really like this one. It goes deep into the why underneath everything we've been circling. Mark the date. I'll have more for you on it next week. All right, that's it for today. Your child's ability to handle big feelings was never going to just appear. It had to be built, piece by piece, the same way every other skill in their life was built. If they're struggling with it now, that's not a character flaw. And it's not a sign you've failed at something everyone else figured out. It just means the skill isn't finished being built yet, and now you know which pieces to actually work on. If this episode named something you've been living with, hit the share button and send it to another parent who needs to hear that this is teachable, not fixed. That strategy I just gave you, it's the whole climbing fish philosophy in action. There's a quote, "Everybody's a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing it's stupid." Your kid isn't broken. Your parenting isn't broken. Sometimes we're just asking our fish to climb trees. That's what we fix here. I'm Dr. Christy, and I'll see you next week.